The Poisoned Ink. Chapter 1, The Collector's Last Words. Jessica Fletcher had been to many literary salons, but Helena Vaughn's soirees were unlike any other. Helena was one of those rare book collectors whose passion turned her library into a shrine. Oak shelves lined with calfskin bindings, first editions wrapped in velvet, and glass cases that gleamed beneath chandelier light gave the impression of a private museum. Jessica had been invited to speak on her latest novel, but even she felt overshadowed by the treasures surrounding her. The evening had begun warmly. A small crowd of bibliophiles, lawyers, and scholars mingled over sherry and canapes. Helena, dressed in violet silk, carried herself with the imperious pride of a woman used to admiration. Yet her laughter, sharp, sudden, and too loud, hinted at something brittle beneath. Jessica noticed the peculiar weight of Helena's attention on two men in the room, Professor Lionel Dacre, a silver-haired jurist with a reputation for brilliance and arrogance, and Martin Grieve, a younger colleague of Helena's who often handled legal negotiations for her collection. The three spoke together in clipped tones, their exchanges tinged with an undercurrent Jessica could not quite place. It was near midnight when the mood shifted. Helena, hosting from her favorite red-upholstered chair, raised a fountain pen, slender, ivory-handled, tipped with gold, to make a toast. She praised literature, justice, and the eternal power of ink to preserve truth. As she lowered the pen, her hand trembled. A sudden pallor swept her face. She gasped, clutched the pen to her chest, and collapsed to the floor. Chaos erupted. Guests surged forward, cries filling the vaulted room. Jessica knelt beside Helena, but one glance told her the truth: Helena Vaughn was dead. The police would later call it heart failure. Jessica, however, noticed two details others overlooked. First, a faint almond scent clung to the pen, subtle but unmistakable. Second, Helena's final gesture had been to press the pen to her heart as if she recognized its treachery. Jessica Fletcher had stumbled into murder once again. Chapter 2, A Library of Secrets. The following morning, Jessica returned to Helena Vaughn's mansion, summoned by Inspector Mallory of the Cabot Cove Police. Though his jurisdiction seldom extended into Boston's private circles, Helena's sudden death had raised enough suspicion, and enough influential eyebrows, that he welcomed Jessica's perspective. The library where Helena had collapsed had been sealed overnight. Dust sheets still draped in used chairs, the air stale with the lingering scent of paper, leather, and faintly, almond. Jessica's senses sharpened. Bitter almonds, cyanide. She didn't need a toxicology report to recognize it. Mallory gestured toward the fountain pen, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Medical examiner's preliminary said cardiac arrest, he muttered. But you don't think so? Jessica shook her head. Cyanide works quickly. The pen might have been tampered with, perhaps the ink reservoir. She asked to see Helena's writing desk. A polished walnut bureau stood against the far wall, littered with correspondence, blotting pads, and embossed stationery. Jessica opened a drawer and found dozens of pens, each carefully arranged. But only one, the ivory-handled pen Helena had used, looked recently cleaned. Its barrel gleamed too brightly, almost polished. What was she working on? Jessica asked. Mallory handed her a folder of documents collected from the scene. They contained legal notes on acquisitions, contracts with dealers, and most intriguingly, letters exchanged with Professor Lionel Dacre. One sheet bore smudges of wet ink, the words unfinished, betrayal in the most unexpected, the rest trailed off. Jessica studied the handwriting. Helena had been recording something urgent, perhaps a warning. But to whom? At that moment, Martin Grieve appeared at the door, eyes red-rimmed, his suit rumpled from a sleepless night. "I can't believe she's gone," he said. Helena was difficult, yes, but brilliant. She lived for her collection. Jessica asked gently, "Did she confide in you recently? About enemies, disputes, quarrels?" Martin hesitated. Collectors always quarrel. Provenance, ownership, authenticity, these aren't just academic squabbles, Mrs. Fletcher. They're wars. But Helena, he lowered his voice. She hinted that someone was using the law against her. Someone she trusted. Mallory raised a brow. "You think it was Dacre?" Martin's lips tightened. Lionel Dacre loved power more than truth. And Helena had recently refused him access to one of her rarest manuscripts, the Codex Juris, a medieval volume rumored to contain annotations by Sir Edward Coke himself. That rejection wounded his pride. Jessica's gaze shifted to the tall glass case in the center of the library. Inside rested a thick tome bound in cracked leather, its clasps engraved with Latin script. The Codex Juris. Its lock was intact, but Jessica noticed faint scratches around the keyhole. Someone had tried to open it recently. She turned back to Martin. "Did Helena ever change her will?" A flicker crossed his face. "She spoke of it. But I don't know if she finalized anything. If she did, it would name who inherits this collection, and that's worth millions." Jessica knew then, this was not just about pride or books. It was about inheritance, influence, and betrayal. As she left the library, she passed a wall hung with framed portraits of jurists and judges. Their stern eyes seemed to follow her. For a brief, unsettling moment, Jessica felt as though Helena herself were watching, urging her to uncover which of her colleagues had turned ink into poison. The mystery of the poisoned pen had only begun. Chapter 3: The Scholar's Pride. By the afternoon, Boston's academic quarter was buzzing with gossip. Professor Lionel Dacre's name was whispered in lecture halls and law libraries alike. He was a man accustomed to both reverence and resentment, a jurist whose interpretations of 17th-century legal texts were as celebrated as they were controversial. Jessica had arranged to meet him at his office in Cambridge, a cavernous room with shelves stacked high with vellum-bound commentaries, Roman digests, and rare folios. Dacre received her with polished courtesy, though his pale blue eyes were as cold as the marble bust of Cicero on his desk. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, gesturing toward a leather chair. "You arrive on unfortunate business." "I do," Jessica replied. "Helena Vaughn's death was tragic." "You knew her well?" "Professionally," Dacre said, steepling his fingers. "We both believed in the sanctity of law preserved in ink. Though Helena, alas, had a collector's sentimentality. She treated books as relics. I treat them as instruments." Jessica studied him closely. "She refused you access to the Codex Juris." A flash of irritation crossed his face. "I merely wished to verify a claim, that the marginalia contained annotations by Coke himself. Do you realize what that would mean for legal history? It would reshape the foundations of common law scholarship. And Helena kept it locked away, like a miser hoarding coins." "Would that refusal," Jessica asked carefully, "be reason enough to quarrel?" Dacre leaned forward, voice low and measured. "Mrs. Fletcher, do not mistake my passion for violence. I am a scholar, not a poisoner." Helena's paranoia led her to imagine enemies everywhere. "If she has met with misfortune, I suspect the cause lies closer to her circle of confidants than among her peers." Jessica noted his choice of words, poisoner. She had never mentioned poison aloud. Either Dacre guessed the truth, or already knew. Before she could press further, a knock sounded at the door. A young assistant entered, arms full of papers, eyes darting nervously at Jessica. She caught sight of a sheet at the top of the stack, legal drafts bearing Helena Vaughn's signature. Dacre hastily covered them with his hand. "Research agreements," he said smoothly. "Helena and I were corresponding until quite recently." Jessica felt the weight of contradiction. He had claimed a professional distance, yet these letters suggested a deeper entanglement. That evening, Jessica dined with Inspector Mallory at a small bistro near Beacon Hill. Over soup and rolls, she shared her impressions. "Dacre is brilliant, arrogant, and ambitious," she said. "He had motive, both pride and scholarship. But I'm not convinced he had opportunity." Mallory stirred his coffee. "The coroner confirmed your suspicion. Cyanide in the ink. Whoever prepared that pen wanted Helena dead the moment she wrote with it. That means access to her private desk. Which narrows the field," Jessica mused. Martin Greaves certainly had access. He handled her legal correspondence. Mallory frowned. "And he'd benefit if she changed her will in his favor." Jessica added, "unless someone else forged the documents. Those papers I glimpsed in Dacre's office, what if Helena had begun revising her bequests, and someone tampered with the drafts?" The inspector sighed. "I'll request warrants, but academics guard their papers like treasure. Meanwhile, the press is circling. Wealthy collector dies mysteriously? They'll have a field day." Later that night, Jessica returned alone to Helena's mansion. The police guard at the door recognized her and allowed her through. The house was unnervingly silent, the grand clock in the hall ticking like a metronome. She walked into the library once more, letting her eyes roam across the spines of books Helena had loved. On the desk lay a blotter Jessica hadn't noticed before. She held it up to the lamplight. Impressions of the last words Helena wrote became visible, betrayal in the most unexpected hand. The phrase chilled Jessica. Helena had been warning herself, or Jessica? Which hand did she mean? A literal hand that wrote, or a trusted colleague who betrayed her with ink? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound. The faint creak of a floorboard above. Jessica froze. Someone else was in the house. She set the blotter down quietly and moved toward the staircase. But by the time she reached the landing, the sound had vanished. Only silence remained, heavy as the rows of books below. Jessica knew then that the murderer was not finished. Helena Vaughn's death had silenced one voice, but others, including Jessica's, were now in danger of being written out. The poisoned ink had spilled into more than paper. It had spilled into lives. Chapter 4, The Will and the Codex. The Vaughn mansion was colder the second evening Jessica returned, as if Helena's absence had turned the stately rooms into a mausoleum. Inspector Mallory had arranged to meet her there with the estate lawyer, a tidy man named Clifford Henshaw whose bowler hat and precise diction made him seem more clerk than counselor. On the long oak table in the drawing room, Henshaw placed a sheaf of documents. Miss Vaughn executed her last will 6 months ago. It names her niece, Clara Vaughn, as primary heir to the estate, including the library. However, he hesitated, shuffling a second stack. A codicil was drafted 2 weeks ago, never formally filed. It redistributed several key items, most notably, the Codex Juris, to the custody of Professor Lionel Dacre, for the advancement of legal scholarship. Mallory let out a low whistle. That's millions of dollars in rare manuscripts. Jessica leaned forward. Was the codicil in Helena's handwriting? Henshaw adjusted his spectacles. It appears to be. But I should caution, the draft was interrupted. Several lines trail off, unfinished. Almost as though she was prevented from completing it. Jessica thought of the blotter impressions, betrayal in the most unexpected hand. If Helena began to sign but never finished, perhaps she realized the document itself was a trap. Clara Vaughn, a young woman in her late 20s with earnest gray eyes, sat stiffly at the table. Aunt Helena may have admired Professor Dacre's brilliance, but she didn't trust him. She told me once that he saw books as trophies, not truths. I can't believe she'd leave him the codex. Jessica studied Clara carefully. Grief clung to her, but so did quiet intelligence. She might be a valuable ally, or another suspect. Tell me, Jessica asked gently, who else knew about this codicil? Clara's gaze flicked toward Martin Grieve, who had joined them at the meeting, hands clasped tightly. Martin prepared the paperwork. He always handled Aunt Helena's affairs. Martin bristled. I did as instructed. Helena dictated terms, I transcribed. That's all. If the codicil looks unfinished, it's because she hesitated, not because I tampered with it. Mallory crossed his arms. Convenient hesitation, considering you'd also be executor of the estate. Lots of room for discretion. Jessica intervened before the quarrel spiraled. May I see the codex itself? They adjourned to the library, where the glass case still stood in the center. Mallory unlocked it with the evidence key. Inside, the codex juris lay heavy with centuries, its leather binding cracked, clasps tarnished but firm. Jessica leaned closer. At first glance, it looked untouched, but her trained eye caught subtle irregularities. The edges of several pages were faintly darker, as if exposed to damp or handling more recent than the rest of the book. She asked for gloves and carefully opened it. The vellum pages whispered with age. In the margins of one folio, faint notes in Latin curled like vines. Jessica could not decipher all the words, but she recognized dates, case citations, and the name Coke. Martin breathed sharply. If genuine, this is historic. But Jessica frowned. A faint smear of ink lingered on the lower margin, modern ink, not centuries old. Someone had tampered with the codex, perhaps forging annotations to strengthen a claim. She turned to Henshaw. If Dacre stood to inherit this volume, and the annotations were exposed as fraudulent, his reputation would collapse. He would need Helena dead before she could retract the codicil. Clara looked horrified. Are you saying Professor Dacre? Jessica shook her head. I'm saying someone tampered with both book and will. But whether Dacre himself, or another hand using his ambition as cover, remains to be seen. Later, as the group dispersed, Jessica lingered in the hall. She overheard a whispered exchange between Martin and Clara. You mustn't let this investigation go further, Martin murmured. If they discover the true value of those notes, Dacre won't be the only one under suspicion. Clara's reply was muffled, strained. I don't care about manuscripts, Martin. I care about who killed my aunt. Their footsteps retreated, leaving Jessica unsettled. Martin's warning suggested knowledge of forgery, or worse, complicity. That night, Jessica returned to her hotel room with a stack of notes. She sketched out 3 columns: motive, means, opportunity. Professor Dacre, motive, scholarly pride, inheritance of codex, means, knowledge of ink, chemicals in his lab, opportunity, limited, unless he visited the mansion secretly. Martin Grieve, motive, executor, financial control, possible forger, means, direct access to desk and pen, opportunity, constant presence. Helena Vaughn, motive, inheritance, rivalry with Dacre, means, unknown, opportunity, frequent visits. The pattern formed but refused to lock. Too many hands had touched ink, paper, and will. As Jessica set her pen down, a knock rattled her door. She opened it to find an envelope slipped beneath the threshold. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, scrawled in haste. Beware the book. The ink kills more than words. Jessica felt a chill. The murderer was not only aware of her investigation, they were watching her every move. And now, she realized, the codex juris was no longer just evidence. It was bait. Chapter 5, A Second Attempt. Morning light spilled across the Boston skyline, but Jessica Fletcher felt none of its warmth. The anonymous note from the night before lay on her hotel desk, its cryptic warning gnawing at her mind. The ink kills more than words. Someone was trying to frighten her, or guide her. She tucked the note into her handbag and set off for the university. Professor Lionel Dacre had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to let her inspect his research laboratory. If Helena's pen had been tampered with, it was possible the poison was prepared there. The laboratory was a curious mixture of past and present, glass beakers and chemical flasks alongside centuries-old texts. Dacre, in his customary tailored suit, hovered with pride as Jessica examined his shelves. "You see, Mrs. Fletcher, scholarship requires precision," he said. "A forged annotation could destroy a reputation. I would never risk mine." Jessica's gaze fell upon a small vial tucked behind a stack of papers. She lifted it carefully. A faint, bitter almond odor confirmed her suspicion. "Cyanide?" she asked. Dacre's face darkened. "Traces for historical ink replication experiments. Nothing more. Poison has many legitimate uses in chemistry. You insult me by implying." Before he could finish, his assistant, a nervous young man named Harper, stumbled in carrying a tray of tea. As he set it down, his hand shook, and a drop of liquid splashed onto a napkin. Jessica leaned forward quickly, sniffing. "Bitter almonds again." "Mr. Harper," she said firmly, "you nearly poisoned us both." The assistant blanched. I didn't know." "Professor, I thought these were the regular vials." Dacre thundered, "Incompetent fool. Out." Harper fled, leaving Jessica unsettled. Was it mere clumsiness, or had the assistant tried to silence her under Dacre's orders? Later that day, Jessica returned to the Vaughn mansion. Clara met her at the door, pale but determined. "Mrs. Fletcher, I've been thinking. The codex isn't the only rare manuscript Aunt Helena owned. She recently purchased a set of letters between early American jurists, letters that hinted at corruption in one of Boston's oldest law firms. If those came to light, reputations would crumble." Jessica's mind raced. Could Helena's death be less about academic rivalry and more about silencing history itself? In the library, Inspector Mallory stood examining the codex with gloved hands. "No sign of forced entry last night," he muttered, but the case was disturbed. Jessica leaned closer. The modern ink smear she'd noticed earlier seemed smudged further, as though someone had tried to erase it. Mallory lowered his voice. "You're making enemies, Jessica. Whoever left that note knows where you're staying." Before Jessica could reply, Martin Grieve entered briskly, carrying fresh papers. "Inspector, Mrs. Fletcher, I've discovered something in Helena's files. Draft contracts transferring ownership of several works, not just the codex, to Professor Dacre. But the signatures look off. Jessica examined them carefully. The flourish of Helena's hand was clumsy, uneven. Forged, undoubtedly. Someone was preparing to defraud her estate, she said. Martin nodded grimly. And with Helena gone, no one could challenge it. Clara looked stricken. But who would benefit? Jessica answered softly, the one who gains both the manuscripts and the credibility of authentic-looking documents. Forgery and murder, bound by ink. That evening, Jessica retired to the library alone to review Helena's journals. One entry, dated 3 days before her death, caught her eye. I fear I have trusted too easily. Betrayal wears a familiar face. If anything happens, the codex will reveal the truth. Jessica's fingers trembled as she turned the page. The ink shimmered faintly under lamplight, almost too fresh. She bent closer and inhaled. A faint almond scent curled upward. Suddenly, her vision blurred. The room swam. She staggered back, realizing too late, the journal itself had been laced with poison. Clara rushed in, shrieking, Mrs. Fletcher. She snatched the book from Jessica's hand, dropping it onto the table. Mallory stormed in seconds later, calling for a medic. Jessica steadied herself with deep breaths. She had inhaled only briefly, but the danger was clear. The killer had tried to silence her just as they had Helena. When she could speak, she whispered, the ink wasn't only in Helena's pen. The killer is laying traps in her papers, her books, her very legacy. Mallory swore under his breath. That means anyone handling this collection is at risk. Jessica's mind sharpened despite the dizziness. Someone had both the knowledge to prepare poisoned ink and the access to place it where Helena would use it. That narrowed the suspects. Her gaze turned toward Martin Grieve, who had returned, wide-eyed with concern. Who else handled these journals? She asked. Martin swallowed. Only myself. I catalogued them last week. Jessica's voice was steady. Then either you're the target of a frame, or you're the hand Helena warned about. Later, alone in her hotel room, Jessica spread her notes across the bed. 2 attempts in 2 days, one with poisoned tea, another with a tainted journal. The killer was growing desperate. She listed possibilities. If Dacre ordered Harper to serve poisoned tea, why risk such a clumsy method? If Martin forged Helena's signatures, why try to kill Jessica now, when her testimony could incriminate Dacre? If Clara wanted the library untouched, why not simply inherit quietly without stirring suspicion? Her pen hovered, then she wrote a single word at the top of the page, motive. In the end, murder always circled back to motive. Helena's death had less to do with books than with power. Who held it, who feared losing it, who would kill to keep it? Jessica closed her notebook with a decisive snap. Tomorrow, she would confront Professor Dacre directly. If he was innocent, he would have to prove it, not with words, but with truth. And if he was guilty, the poisoned ink would write his downfall. Chapter 6, Confrontations. The next morning, Jessica Fletcher arrived at Cambridge University with Inspector Mallory at her side. The air was raw with drizzle, the kind that clung to coats and dampened tempers. They found Professor Lionel Dacre pacing his office, the normally composed scholar visibly frayed. "I'll not have my reputation smeared by whispering insinuations," he barked as they entered. "The newspapers are already circling, hungry for scandal." Jessica regarded him evenly. "Professor, this investigation isn't about scandal. It's about truth. Helena Vaughn was murdered with cyanide ink." You kept cyanide in your laboratory, and Helena's codicil favored you directly. That places you under considerable suspicion. Dacre's pale eyes glittered. Suspicion is not proof. Yes, I experimented with ink replication. Yes, I desired the codex. But would I kill Helena to obtain it? Absurd. Her collection was valuable, but so is my reputation. Murder would destroy everything I have built. Mallory pressed, what about the poison tea your assistant nearly served Jessica yesterday? The professor slammed his fist onto the desk. Harper is incompetent, not malicious. If anything, I've suspected he's been manipulated. Papers have gone missing from my study, drafts misfiled. He may have been bribed by someone eager to discredit me. Jessica leaned forward. Then you admit someone close to Helena, and perhaps to you, is orchestrating forgery and murder. Dacre's mouth tightened. If so, I suggest you look at Martin Grieve. He handled Helena's legal affairs, had constant access to her desk, and stood to profit enormously by controlling her estate. Do not let his soft-spoken manner fool you, Mrs. Fletcher. He is ambitious. Ruthless, even. Jessica and Mallory left the office in silence, drizzle slicking the cobblestones. At last Mallory muttered, he's arrogant, but I didn't read guilt in his eyes. Jessica nodded slowly. Arrogance can shield guilt, but it can also mask fear. If Dacre is innocent, then someone is feeding evidence to implicate him. Her thoughts returned to the smudged ink in the codex, the unfinished codicil, the poisoned journals. The pattern wasn't simple opportunism. It was a calculated attempt to frame one suspect while concealing another. That evening, Jessica requested a private meeting with Martin Grieve in Helena's library. The firelight flickered against the glass case of the codex as he arrived, his expression taut. You wanted to see me, Mrs. Fletcher? Yes, Jessica said gently. You were close to Helena. You managed her affairs, you shared her confidences. Yet twice now, poisoned documents under your supervision have nearly killed me. Why should I believe you're not responsible? Martin paled, his hands trembling. Because I loved her, he blurted. Not just as a colleague, as a woman. Helena never returned the sentiment, but she trusted me. I'd never harm her. Jessica's heart softened, though she remained cautious. Then why did she write of betrayal by a familiar hand? His shoulders sagged. I don't know. Unless she discovered the forgeries. Jessica arched a brow. Forged signatures, forged annotations, those require more than a lawyer's pen. They require someone with access to both manuscripts and Helena's personal style of writing. Martin's voice dropped to a whisper. Clara. Jessica froze. Her niece? She knew the inheritance was contested, Martin said, eyes darting toward the staircase. Clara often visited under the guise of helping catalog. She had access. And she hated that Helena treated her like a child, never a successor. Perhaps she thought framing Dacre would remove both rivals at once. At that moment, Clara appeared in the doorway, face pale but eyes blazing. You lie, she hissed. You'd blame me to hide your own guilt. Jessica rose, holding up a calming hand. No accusations tonight. But understand this, Clara, 2 lives have nearly been taken by poisoned ink. One truth will surface, no matter how well disguised. Clara's gaze flickered, then she fled into the hall. Martin groaned. She'll ruin me, Mrs. Fletcher. If she convinces Mallory I forged those codicils, my career, my life, it's finished. Jessica studied him carefully. Fear etched every line of his face. But fear of exposure, or fear of guilt? Later, alone in her hotel, Jessica replayed every detail. Clara's anger, Martin's desperation, Dacre's pride. Which motive outweighed the others? She pulled out Helena's blotter once again. The impressions haunted her, betrayal in the most unexpected hand. Unexpected. The word gnawed at her. Not the ambitious scholar, not the loyal lawyer, not even the resentful niece. Someone Helena trusted least to betray her, yet who had the means? Jessica's eyes widened. She thought of Harper, the trembling assistant. His access to both Helena and Dacre's work. His nervous demeanor, his clumsy mistake with the poisoned tea. What if the mistake had been staged? She scribbled notes furiously. Harper had opportunity, chemical knowledge through Dacre's lab, and a chance to plant poisoned ink. But why? Then she remembered Clara's whispered words earlier that week. Aunt Helena bought letters exposing corruption in an old Boston law firm. If Harper's family, or his benefactors, were implicated in those letters, he might have had a desperate reason to silence Helena, while ensuring suspicion fell on his employer, Professor Dacre. The puzzle shifted in her mind, pieces locking into place. Betrayal, indeed, by the most unexpected hand. The next morning, Jessica arranged a final confrontation in Helena's library. Mallory, Clara, Martin, Dacre, and Harper were all summoned. The fire crackled, shadows dancing on shelves of books as Jessica began. Helena Vaughn's death was no accident. She said. It was a murder carried out with ink, poisoned ink prepared by someone with access to chemicals, manuscripts, and opportunity. At first, suspicion fell on Professor Dacre. His arrogance, his rivalry with Helena, the codicil naming him heir, everything pointed toward him. Dacre bristled but said nothing. But Helena herself left a clue, Jessica continued. Her blotter recorded the phrase, betrayal in the most unexpected hand. The murderer was not the rival scholar, nor the grieving niece, nor even the loyal lawyer. The murderer was the assistant, Mr. Harper. Gasps filled the room. Harper staggered back, face draining of color. You tampered with Helena's pen, Jessica pressed. You smeared modern ink into the codex to forge notes, ensuring suspicion would fall on Professor Dacre. You laced her journals, then tried to poison me with tea. And you did it because those letters Helena acquired threatened to expose a scandal tied to your family's law connections. Harper's lips trembled. You can't prove. Mallory stepped forward, producing gloves and a sealed bag. Inside lay the journal Jessica had nearly inhaled. The lab found your fingerprints under the binding paste. That's proof enough. Harper collapsed into a chair, defeated. She was going to ruin everything. My father's name, our firm's legacy, it would all burn. I only meant to frighten her at first. But when she threatened to publish the letters, his voice cracked. I had no choice. Jessica's gaze softened, though her words were firm. There is always a choice. Helena chose truth. You chose poison. Mallory signaled his men. Harper was led away, head bowed, as silence settled heavy upon the library. The codex juris gleamed behind its glass case, an eternal witness to both justice and betrayal. Chapter 7, The Letters of Fire. The arrest of Harper left the Vaughn mansion heavy with silence. Yet Jessica Fletcher sensed the mystery was not entirely resolved. Harper's confession explained Helena's sudden death, but the web of forged documents, poisoned journals, and smudged annotations in the codex still held loose threads. And Helena's last words on the blotter, betrayal in the most unexpected hand, suggested more layers than even Harper had admitted. Inspector Mallory, though satisfied with the arrest, admitted unease as they reviewed the evidence in the library. "Harper's motive checks out," he said. "Protecting his family's law firm from exposure. But why poison Helena's private journals after she was already dead? And why risk tampering with the codex?" Jessica tapped the glass of the display case thoughtfully. "Because Harper wasn't acting alone. Someone guided his hand, or at least encouraged it. Think about it, Inspector. Helena was preparing to expose corruption in old letters. Harper panicked, yes, but who stood to gain most from framing Dacre and destabilizing the estate?" Mallory frowned. "You're suggesting a second conspirator?" Jessica nodded. The codex annotations were forged with a practiced legal hand. Harper may have supplied the chemicals, but he lacked the scholarly subtlety. No, someone else tried to build a narrative where Helena's death would appear as Dacre's ambition run amok. Later that afternoon, Jessica sought out Clara Vaughn. She found her in Helena's private study, staring at a portrait of her aunt. Clara looked smaller in the dim light, her grief etched in the slump of her shoulders. "She never believed in me," Clara murmured. "Always said I was too young, too impatient. But I could have learned. I wanted to be her heir in more than name." Jessica placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Your aunt was difficult, yes, but she trusted you enough to make you beneficiary. That's no small thing." Clara shook her head. "And yet she considered giving the codex to Dacre. Do you know how that felt? As if she chose him over me." Jessica's heart tightened. "Clara, did you ever help your aunt with her journals or letters?" The young woman's eyes flickered, just for a second, before she composed herself. "Sometimes. She dictated, and I wrote. But she always revised my work. Always corrected me." Jessica recognized the defensive tone. Clara had handled Helena's handwriting often enough to attempt forgery. But was her motive strong enough to risk murder? Or had she simply resented being overlooked? That night, Jessica pored over the letters Helena had acquired. They were fragile sheets penned in the 18th century, their edges brittle. As she translated the archaic script, the story unfolded: a Boston law firm concealing illegal land seizures, its partners enriched through deceit. The revelations were damning, and one name leapt out at Jessica like fire: Grieve and Sons. Martin Grieve's family. Jessica sat back, pulse quickening. If Helena had threatened to publish these letters, Martin would lose more than reputation. His family legacy, his career, his very livelihood would collapse. The pieces clicked. Martin, not Clara, had the expertise to forge legal signatures and annotations. Martin had access to Helena's desk, her pens, her journals. Martin had whispered warnings about Clara, skillfully redirecting suspicion. And Martin had claimed to love Helena, love twisted enough to silence her when she turned against him. The following day, Jessica invited Martin for a walk in the garden behind the Vaughn estate. The autumn air was sharp, leaves crunching underfoot. "Martin," Jessica began softly, "I read the letters Helena acquired. They implicated your family's firm in historic corruption. You must have realized what their publication would mean." His face stiffened. "Old papers. Irrelevant now." "Not irrelevant," Jessica countered. "For a man building a career on law and ethics, they'd be ruinous. Helena held your fate in her hands. So you took hers." Martin stopped walking, eyes flashing. "You think I poisoned her?" Jessica met his gaze steadily. You prepared the codicil to favor Dacre, knowing it would cast suspicion on him. You smeared modern ink into the codex, giving credence to the idea of academic fraud. You even poisoned her journals to silence anyone who might read her warnings. And then you whispered Clara's name, planting seeds of doubt. It was elegant. But Helena saw through it in the end. Her blotter recorded the truth. His voice trembled, but with anger, not fear. You underestimate me, Mrs. Fletcher. Everything I did was for preservation. My family's name, my firm's standing. Helena would have destroyed us. Justice isn't destroyed by ink, Mr. Grieve, Jessica said quietly. It's destroyed by those who fear it. He turned abruptly, striding toward the gate. But Mallory emerged from the hedgerow, handcuffs ready. That's far enough, counselor. We've got Helena's fingerprints on the codicil drafts, but your ink stains layered over them. Forensics will do the rest. Martin's shoulders slumped. So Helena wins, even in death, he muttered, as the cuffs snapped closed. That evening, Jessica sat once more in the library, the fire crackling warmly. Clara entered hesitantly. Is it truly over? Jessica gave a tired smile. Yes. Harper was a pawn, frightened into action. But Martin orchestrated it all. Helena knew. She left her clue on the blotter for anyone patient enough to see. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. And now her legacy survives. Jessica looked at the codex, gleaming behind its glass. Yes. But her true legacy isn't the manuscripts. It's the reminder that truth, once written, cannot be poisoned forever. Chapter 8, Justice in the Margins. The courtroom was packed, the scent of old wood and polished brass mingling with anticipation. Though not a formal trial, the hearing into Helena Vaughn's estate and the circumstances of her death had drawn scholars, reporters, and curious onlookers. At the center sat Martin Grieve, his once polished composure replaced by drawn features and hollow eyes. Jessica Fletcher took the witness chair, calm under the scrutiny. Inspector Mallory presided at her side, offering the official account, but it was Jessica's clear voice that carried the weight of truth. Helena Vaughn was murdered not by strangers or rivals, she began, but by those closest to her. The ink that took her life was no accident of chemistry. It was prepared with intent, planted in the very tool she used daily. The purpose was twofold: to silence her before she could expose historic corruption, and to misdirect suspicion toward her academic rival, Professor Lionel Dacre. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Dacre, seated stiffly in the audience, adjusted his spectacles, relief mingling with indignation. Jessica continued, Mr. Grieve, entrusted with her affairs, exploited that trust. He forged codicils to divert manuscripts, tampered with the codex juris to fabricate annotations, and poisoned journals to eliminate evidence. He recruited or manipulated Harper, the professor's assistant, to supply chemicals and bear the risk of clumsy mistakes. Yet the true architect was not Harper, it was Martin Grieve. Martin rose suddenly, voice sharp. You make it sound so cold, Mrs. Fletcher. But you don't understand, Helena was ready to destroy everything my family built. Those letters would have reduced generations of work to scandal. I did what I had to do. Jessica's gaze did not waver. No legacy is worth a life, Mr. Grieve. Helena may have collected books, but she valued truth above all. You chose lies written in poison. The magistrate ordered Martin removed. Harper, pale and broken, gave his own halting testimony, confirming how Martin had convinced him to prepare the ink under the pretense of scholarly experiments. With that, the conspiracy was laid bare. By evening, the Vaughn mansion was quieter, the storm of scandal abated. Clara, now the rightful heir, walked Jessica through the library. Dust motes swirled in lamplight as she touched the spines of Helena's beloved volumes. "I don't know what to do with it all," Clara admitted. "The codex, the letters, the collections, it feels too heavy a burden." Jessica smiled gently. "Perhaps that's Helena's final gift. She's left you not just her books, but the responsibility of preserving truth. Do not guard them as relics. Share them as she would have, so knowledge can outlive deceit." Clara's eyes softened. "I'll try. For her, and for you." Later, Jessica sat alone in the study where it had all begun. The blotter still bore faint impressions of Helena's final message, now preserved as evidence. Betrayal in the most unexpected hand. Jessica reflected on those words. Betrayal seldom comes from enemies, it comes from those whose closeness blinds us. Helena's trust in Martin had been her undoing, just as his fear of exposure had been his. Jessica rose, glancing once more at the codex juris under its glass. Books endure, so do the truths they hold. Poison can silence a voice, but it cannot erase what has been written in ink, or memory. As she stepped into the autumn night, Inspector Mallory joined her. "You've done it again, Jessica. Solved what seemed unsolvable." She gave a rueful smile. "No, Inspector. Helena solved it herself. She left the clue in her own hand. I merely listened." The lamps of Boston flickered along the street, their glow soft against the encroaching dark. Jessica pulled her scarf tighter and walked on, her mind already turning to the next mystery waiting just beyond the page.